Thanks, Ryan. Really amazing conversations this morning, everybody thus far, audience and participants. And I'd like to thank Ryan and Remco. I've been to a number of Art Engine events over the years, and they're always very thoughtful and very kind of ahead of the curve. So I don't know, I think our hosts deserve a bit of a hand of some applause here for some great work. Yeah, great. So my name's Greg Smith. I'm a writer and editor. I guess I got in trouble from Tom, who presented earlier. He's my former thesis advisor, and I need to get the fact that I used to be an architect back in my bio, apparently. So I did a bunch of research. I kind of am active in the media art space. And I decided to okay, great. I come to kind of craft from the perspective of artists are using 3D printers and what does that mean, et cetera, et cetera. It's exciting. I'm going to read a bunch of old texts on ceramics and stuff like that, and dial back in a craft space. And I found this essay by Rose, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Silvica, called "The New Ceramics Presence." And essentially, it was this 1961 essay on ceramics, and there was all this energy around modernization and kind of the ascent of industry. And it sounded exactly like the way that we're talking about 3D printing and manufacturing today. So some interesting parallels there. And one of the things that I thought about this morning, and that nobody has really mentioned that much, we heard the word confusion a lot, we heard the word anxiety less. I think a lot of these conversations about rapid technologization of fields or automation are accompanied by anxiety. And if we just look around, just 3 days ago in Pittsburgh, Uber launched what is essentially the first fleet of automated cars in the world. It's a 100-car fleet of modified Volvos. They have human assistant drivers that are basically there so the people in the cars, they can grab the wheel if anything bad happens. And also the passenger has the right to say, "Can you please drive?" And there's also a big stop the car button. There's a red button that's literally stop, stop. I'm nervous. I'm not comfortable with this. So I think that button is an interesting button. Anybody that's been in a machine shop and seen a CNC mill, of course, there is one of those buttons because things can go horribly wrong. CNC machines are essentially like Old Testament gods. They're very unforgiving. They follow instructions quite well. So yeah, the big red button, I think that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. And interestingly, the mayor of Pittsburgh, in ushering in Uber, and he's trying to retool Pittsburgh as a new high-tech city, he said you can either put up red tape or roll out the red carpet when it comes to capital I innovation. And maybe either of those positions is a little bit suspect. So hopefully today we're talking about something in between those two receptions. So this is amongst my kind of digging into more, can I call this traditional craft? This is a project by Dave Cole at Mass Mocha from 2005 called Knitting Machine. Excavators, obviously, those are giant aluminum poles. What you can just see at the edge is a cherry picker. So essentially he was up there as an operator, somebody working on a telephone line with this big needle hook doing knitting. And I think, so this is acrylic mesh, and I think there's something 500 or 100 stitches, and they basically made the flag on July 4th. Interesting project, not just because it's performative, but just in supersizing the scale, it takes something that we're familiar with and defamiliarizes it. It's mechanized. Using knitting needles is, of course, mechanized, but it somehow abstracts something that's somewhat familiar. So a lot of these technologies we're talking about now, they perform very much in the same sense as this. And this is a great project. Maybe some of you have seen this before. Another thing that I looked at when I was preparing for this was I finally got around to reading Bruce Sterling's book, Shaping Things, from 2005. And anybody that's enjoyed today, I would highly recommend tracking down this book, because it's kind of Sterling at his meandering best, kind of thinking about products. And in it, he talks a lot about, he basically lays out the schema of objects in the world and kind of pontificates in what he calls the technosocial relationships we have with them. And he talks about things that are essentially artifacts, which are made by hunters and farmers, machines, which are made by or for customers, products, which are made for consumers, and then gizmos, which are made for end users. So, our cool new Apple Watch would be a gizmo, and our toaster would be a product. So Thomas Thwaites, who's a designer who describes himself as a designer of the speculative sort, he doesn't want to be called a speculative designer, but he affiliates himself loosely with that approach to practice, came out of RCA in London several years ago. And essentially what he did was, he's like, I want to make a toaster. I want to learn how to make a toaster. So he picked this model. It's called the Argos Value Range. And he started researching it. So he bought a couple and took them apart and looked at all the parts and thought about its assembly and thought about its materiality, and very quickly realized he couldn't make it. There was over 100 materials in it, which was not feasibly obtainable by one individual. So obviously, in exploding that toaster, he revealed a very complex relationship with the supply chain and rare earth minerals, et cetera, manufacturing processes that many of us don't have to deal with in any capacity. What he did was make a toaster in 5 materials, which was iron, copper, plastic, nickel, and mica. And as you can see, it's a strange creation, but it did work in some sense. And it's neat because he's alluding to a product, but it is an artifact because it's artist made. So I mean, there is a craft to this in some sense, right? There's also an aesthetics to it that we won't talk about, but it's a very interesting project. Oh, I'm missing a slide. Anyways, I had this really lovely slide of this Air-Up machine component that I saw on Twitter a little while ago, and there's kind of a backstory too. But Air-Up like Autodesk, who we'll hear about, and many companies kind of interested in kind of communicating their innovation within their praxis. Essentially, they created this way to make algorithmically optimized structural nodes. So it was this super organic and sinewy looking like connector, which was about 4 times as much to produce as like a standardized part. But the idea was that you could take an engineering problem, run an algorithm on what's going on structurally around it and make a connector that was kind of optimized. And the resulting form had kind of nothing in common with traditional kind of off-the-shelf parts. It was exactly as it needed to be, and the aesthetic was almost alien. So it was very interesting because there's almost this removal of the hand from the process. I don't know, it might be an over-exaggeration to call it co-creation with an algorithm, but it's an algorithmic design. So one of the things I do think we'll talk about today is exactly that, kind of the alien aesthetics and new aesthetics that emerge from the digital. And then one last thing, which I'm happy to follow through on, just Joanna mentioned the Jacquard project, which is a Google initiative. This is a close-up of exactly the type of thing she was talking about. It was a little square of conductive thread on a new Google/Levi's commuter jacket. And I'm happy to report I do know what it does. What it does is a jacket intended for cyclists. So the conductive thread is under that little toggle, and essentially what that is that's like a USB power thing, and like you can do gestures on your arm, and you can hook it up to anything running through your phone. So your jacket essentially becomes a media controller for your phone, and you can assign, open Google Maps, or read directions out, et cetera, or delete that email, or read that email to me audibly. The type of stuff that was imagined with Google Glass and stuff. But I mean, this is so interesting because categorically it so problematizes the idea of what a piece of clothing is once you're kind of making it an interface for your computer. So this is even, it's one thing to talk about making things digitally, but once you're kind of combining different craft and maybe even computation paradigms, things get weird and I don't know. I mean, Joanna talked about this as productification of things, and I guess this is definitely an example of that. So this is the new reality, and I don't know how much of this exactly is going to butt up with our 2 presenters, but we'll see. We'll see what we can cook up. And one more comment: that chair could have been for a librarian. That was something I realized this morning because I almost felt like the librarian was our MIA other person that had something to say about fabrication. So maybe we'll try to ask a question or 2 on their behalf later. So our 2 speakers today, I'll let them introduce themselves and their talks, but very briefly, Sarah Brin is a currently Los Angeles-based curator. Nomadic. Okay, no fixed address. Just having recently spent a bunch of time setting up the Pier 9 residency program at Autodesk, which was also mentioned earlier, so we'll hear about that, I'm sure. And James Hayes, you're a Carleton-based PhD in architecture, doing work in and around kind of intersecting traditional craft and stonework with digital fabrication techniques, and also, like Tom Besai earlier, kind of thinking about architectural practice in light of this changing toolkit. And James, you're up first.
Let's make sure this is on, everybody can hear. Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the most important things to get across at first is just that I'm coming from the position of an architect. So again, everything that I'm going to be talking about is through that lens. So don't despair if I disparage your favorite technology or whatever. But again, I think there's a lot of technologies that are doing some interesting things, And I think some work in the realm of architecture and others don't. So I see my slides are a bit large, but I think the main difference between architectural making and just kind of making in general, there's many different forms of making, is that the idea that there is a translation process. And Robin Evans has a famous essay, Translations from Drawing to Building. And in a sense, there are two kinds of translations. And if you see, I'm saying that Robin Evans makes a statement drawing to building, but really there's a whole bunch of translations that happen from floor plans to sketches to watercolors. And an architect might do a sketch and hand it off to somebody else, and then they turn it into a BIM model or they turn it into rendering, and then someone actually writes a specification. And then there's a giant translation, and that giant translation happens when someone collects all these things together, turns them into contract documents, and then hands it over to a contractor, and then that gets translated into a building. It's not entirely unique to architecture. There's I heard the fashion, one of the first speakers, I apologize for not remembering the name, but that the fashion designer comes up with something and it disappears and comes back fully formed as a dress. But in general, makers are dealing with the medium and the final outcome quite immediate to them. And architects, on the other hand, are doing a bunch of virtual activities that then get translated into a building. Now, the digital fabrication, I think, brings two, or can kind of exacerbate that notion of translation in a couple different ways, more than two, but I'm going to talk specifically about two. And one is, I should also say that I'm also an architect, but I'm doing my PhD and do some teaching as well at Carleton. And so a lot of this is directed maybe in some of the observations I see of the way students are approaching some of these technologies. So one of them being that there's this idea that you can just have this thing in the computer and print it out, and it's just this one-to-one thing, push the button, it's very easy. And I think that is a bit of an illusion, propagated a lot by 3D printing. And again, if you are not taking into consideration that thing that you just 3D printed isn't the building itself. The thing that you just 3D printed then leads to a building. And so it's kind of problematic thinking about this kind of one-to-one. It's so easy, push a button. And I'm afraid that a lot of students are going to leave the schools with this idea that building is actually quite easy. The other one is kind of, I'm going to kind of facetiously blame Plato for this one, but it's this idea that, and so I see these two conditions where, so on the one hand it's easy, here's my idea, here's a physical reality, which is usually generally garbage plastic, and on the other hand there's this idea that anything, no matter what, you have the idea, and any time that it gets brought into the real world, there's some kind of degradation, or the word that I've been hearing lately is that it gets sullied. I heard a musician talking on the CBC, which I found really strange considering the difference between architecture and music. But he was saying you always start with an idea, and then when you turn it into a song, that idea gets sullied. And I just find that a strange kind of way to think about things, and I think a lot of people actually think that way. And I guess I'm challenging, and I think it's the wrong way to think about architecture, because if that translation process isn't working, then maybe you need to have a different approach. I think this is a translation that a lot of people can appreciate. And this is a common, I guess, internet meme of kind of failed Pinterest. Someone sees some great thing on Pinterest and they try to do it and it doesn't work. So this is one kind of failed translation, and I think something that's kind of, I think, bubbling under the surface today is this idea of where does skill fit in all this if you're a digital fabricator or a digital maker. And I just want to back up a couple slides. This is just on your left is something I sculpted by hand inside the computer, and then that's a 3D print on the right. But obviously, if we actually look at this image seriously, you can see that this person actually had no clue what they were doing, trying to ice these cupcakes while they're still in the hot tin. And So I think one kind of translation and one kind of degradation of an idea to a reality is just a lot of people just don't have the skill or the knowledge to do it. And that's not to say that they can never have it, but that it actually takes practice and it takes time to develop skills and knowledge and to make things. But there's other ways that things can be translated and not be a success. This as well. So this is a project on the West Block. The point of this was to engage with stonemasons. So on the left is a real stone capital. On the right is a 3D print at a 1-to-1 scale. So you might be able to detect some seams because we had to print it in a couple different pieces. But essentially from a metric standpoint, it is a perfect replica. But on the other hand, it was completely rejected by the stonemasons because of the materiality of it. It was so alien to them. It was so different from stone and other materials that they use, plaster and clay, that they just rejected it out hand. So again, this is kind of a failure of a translation, even though it looks pretty much identical. This is one that's maybe more successful. This is the tympanum. That's the interior part of the arch on the West Block. And this was a CNC cut out of MDF. And this is something, although they were still kind of reluctant, they could actually, the material was more analogous, and they could see that the opportunities that this is maybe something that we could work with. The other aspect that concerns me about digital fabrication in architecture is this idea of control, that it's actually quite messy construction, and there's actually a lot of people involved, so there's a diversity of diversity of actors and a diversity of materials. And I think that a lot of architects are thinking of digital fabrication in a way that says, great, I can get rid of all these guys in the orange vest and just print something out or CNC cut something without their input at all, which again I think is an incredibly naive way to think about it. So now that's kind of some of my, I guess, position. I'm going to just kind of run through really quickly 3 projects. They're fairly different, and it's not to say that this is the right way to do things, but these are just 3 projects that I had a hand in, and some of the experience, I guess, that I got from that. So this, just very quickly, is on the East Block. This is working with Public Works and Government Services Canada, Heritage Conservation Directorate, and Parliamentary Precinct Branch. And this is a project through the Carleton Immersive Media Studio, and the main person that we worked with was someone called the Dominion Sculptor. He's a very, very talented stone sculptor, wood sculptor, bronze castings, everything. So this is just kind of, whoa, it's fast here. It's just going to kind of elucidate, I think, some of the workflows going back from digital to analog. So this is the this is the sculpture. It's a relief sculpture. It's very badly deteriorated. We digitize that. I'm also going to kind of use generic technical terms, and maybe those we can talk about that after, very kind of specific, but we digitize it. We created a replica with a CNC machine, and then if you notice the detail between the owl here and this owl, and that's because after we cut a replica of it on the CNC machine, we give it to the sculptor. He applies a layer of clay by hand to bring out the details again. And I think one interesting thing about the translation, this is clay, and you can see he used a specific tool to apply that clay, but that is not necessarily the effect that he wants to have in stone, so there's kind of another translation process that happens. And along the way, there's the digital, which can cause strange artifacts, again, depending on whether you know what you're doing or not, and whether these things are good, or how, if there's opportunities for weird things to happen, might be good or bad or whatever. But at this time, we were kind of new to this. Digitize it again after the sculptor applies his clay. So now we have a virtually kind of restored version. And then we approached a robotic fabricator. This is a test again out of foam. And this is another big thing. There's a big difference between milling with foam. And this is what I'm talking about, how easy it is to print something. You just hit print and it appears, or CNC mill. Foam, it is actually quite easy. When it comes to stone, it's actually quite difficult. And he actually misled us into believing that he had worked with stone. And so there's this whole process of trying to figure this out, and it took way, way longer than it would have if it had happened by hand. But this is the final result from the robot. Then it goes back to the sculptor, and you can see on the left, that's his work by hand, so he's adding a whole other layer on top of that. And this is still kind of divided in half. On the left is his work, and I always say when I show this image, it doesn't do it justice. Is actually, what his work brings to this is actually tremendous. tremendous to the final product. And I just wanted to put this in counter to in this project that I found online. This is someone who set up a robot to do sculpting, and I just kind of abhor this idea that says the designer has developed the robot so it only needs to rely on people for menial tasks. So I think that we like to take the kind of opposite position, that the robot is there to augment, or to, not to supplant, but to augment the skills of the craftsperson, as opposed to just making a person come back with clay. This is a very different project. It's much more commercial. It's a condominium lobby. I worked on this with Jason Grant Hanley of Charles Fort. Basically, this was the design image that they came up with. I actually did the rendering, but I had no input in the design, so I just kind of distanced myself a little bit from the design. But ultimately, it's kind of the age-old story. They come up with this interesting image, and then they sell their condos, and then it's like, okay, this thing needs to get built. They couldn't find anybody to do it. And I don't think it was necessarily for the sake of skill, but more kind of liability and anyways. So they asked me to help them. This is a scan of the space, so again, digitizing that space. This is the lobby before any of the finishes, so this is raw concrete. So we came up with a structure out of plywood, also, so for a hand-applied plaster finish, and they were very concerned with how the walls, that they wanted actually curved walls. So we did top and bottom plates out of plywood for someone to build studs over top. So again, this very kind of precise curve. And then, you can test this out as a model. I actually did this after the fact, but you can do that. Instead, in reality, we went straight to the plywood. It's fire-rated plywood. This was erected. All the pieces had numbers. And because I had scanned the mechanical system, the plumbing and everything kind of fit well together and came together all at once and no problems. And so most of that stuff is actually going to be hidden, and in a way I kind of like that. Because the digital fabrication doesn't have to be on the forefront. It can be something that guides people in their work. It doesn't have to be the thing out there on its own. But there was one element that we used, a water jet cutter, to do a stainless steel grill. And I just bring this up because, again, working with, I've never used a water jet. And if you see there's some scoring, it's not just cutouts, but there's some scoring. And at first the water jet operator said, no, we can't score, we can only cut. Then he came back and actually doing some research and said, actually, I can control the acceleration and deceleration of the CNC, and we can actually do scoring. So without him, again, I think it's important to be kind of taking a collaborative position. This is the final product, the person actually kind of doing final touch-ups with the hand-applied finish. This is the last project, very different again. I had the pleasure of going to Aarhus School of Architecture in Denmark with Professor Stephen Fye and another PhD candidate, Ken Percy. And we put on a workshop there using some of the technologies that I just showed you. And the idea was that there was this alley that we became familiar with in a former chocolate factory complex. And we just asked the students, they were second-year architecture students, so they had never, some of them had done kind of 3D printing, but they'd never done any photogrammetry or laser scanning. And we asked them to do kind of a hyper-contextualized installation for some place in this alley that they wanted to, they found interesting. And we wanted to push, we didn't want just kind of 3D printing or CNC cutting or whatever. We wanted it to be part of a bigger process or a more interesting workflow. So we're using 3D printing to make casts. This is just a plaster cast. And sometimes they work, sometimes they didn't. But I'm going to show three fairly successful projects here. This one, they identified this kind of weird collection of wires. I don't have a photograph of, but a weird collection of wires in this alley and conduits. They digitized that, much like the OWL project. But again, we're encouraging them not to be afraid to kind of get down and dirty with their hands. So they're sanding. This is after the CNC cut, using sandpaper. This is the final result. The idea was they were going to cast something. Then they decided that they would rather make a latex mold, so putting latex. And then this is the final kind of weird alien project. And again, this is not per se an architectural project, but if they hadn't have done MDF, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's a lot of this kind of residual sawdust that's in that latex that kind of added like a strange patina, and it actually looked like it should belong in this alley in a weird way. Another project was very different. There's on one side of the alley, there's a brick missing, and that's this kind of wood brick that you see. So they digitized that missing piece of wood, CNC cut that. And then on the other side of the alley, there's brick missing on one side. This side, the mortar had been worn away. So they actually digitized that area very precisely, manufactured these pieces that could fit into there. And then the point was to kind of build I guess a bridge that connected the two. And so this is the little connecting piece that they sculpted in the computer, and then they put together, and there was other kind of, we had a little kind of, I guess, vernissage in that alley, and there was lots of other projects. So in closing, some of the questions that were asked of us were, what happens when, computing bumps up against the real world? And I think that, I think it's very important, especially for students, to understand that it should happen actually quite often. That there shouldn't be any fear between going from the digital to the physical and back. And I think there's lots of opportunities that can arise from that. And lastly, there's a question about aesthetics, whether that this will lead inevitably to a new aesthetic. Is that important or whatnot? But I think that ultimately, my interest in digital fabrication lies in the fact that I think that architects have gotten to the point where it is so difficult to the point where there's almost a complete inability to affect architecture at a very kind of small scale. And I don't mean small scale buildings, I mean like details and textures and things like that. And so I think that it's very important, or not that it's very important, but I think that these technologies, I think, can point us in a direction that can lead architects to being able to affect architecture at a much kind of finer grain detail and bring, I think, skill back into it. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Brin. I am a writer and curator. I put together these slides mostly as background, so don't try too hard to make connections to the words that I'm saying and the pictures you're seeing. But to give you a little bit of background about my prior work is I've done a lot of work with artist-made video games, which you can see some of these here. But the work that I've done, and that's probably the most relevant to what we're talking about today, is I worked for 2 years as the public programs manager or in-house curator at the Autodesk Pier 9 workshop. And it's been fun over the course of the day. I think maybe at least half of the projects that have been spoken about today have come through the Pier 9 space at one point or another, which is pretty neat. So I do a lot of work with art and technology, and I'm very, very interested in work that happens in the corner. So that might mean working outside of traditional arts institutions or working with folks who aren't necessarily catered to or target demographics for fields like tech or even traditional arts institutions. I spoke earlier in the week at Carleton, and I'm going to try to not be too redundant to what I said over there, but basically, I shared an anxiety I have about how I often find that, especially in the realms of digital fabrication, but also art made with technology in general, is that form tends to dwarf personal experience and context, and that makes me nervous. This is a image of our water jet cutter, so we're connected. We have things in common. And at the water jet over at Pier 9. And so I want to talk about this. You also spoke about Plato, which I thought was really relevant too. Human beings have always had utopian tendencies, and I think when we think about technology, it's really hard to not be utopian when we think about how technology can improve our life, because it has most certainly, vaccines, refrigeration, all that stuff. But as long as there's technological innovation for growth and creativity, there will continue to be technological advances and tools for destruction and war. So on that positive note, I want to dig into the prompt that Ryan shared with us for this presentation. So it starts with, the world inside the computer is one built on rules that we have written. The world outside is more complicated and largely out of our control. So I would say that part of that is for sure true. We do build the world inside the computer, and subsequently, that means the world inside the computers has bias, just like we do. We see that bias articulated in systems. This is more work being done in Pier 9. Yeah, that's a good one. And so some of these examples of biases include how, if you look at, this was recently corrected, if you look at Google image searches for black folks, you see them tagged as gorillas. Or if you look at when the Microsoft Kinect was first launched, it had problems doing facial recognition detection for folks who were not white Caucasian. So those are just some of the examples in which human biases get articulated into digital spaces. And so I also want to talk about the world that is purportedly out of our control. So something really exciting about makers is that, there's this kind of entrepreneurial individual spirit of discovery and invention that we see in maker culture, but also it's extremely dependent and rooted in community. So all you folks who are in here today, I have reason to believe that you are in one way attached to a specific community, whether it is a university or a makerspace or an arts institution. So we are all cultural producers, as Remco. Well, I want to talk about the idea of cultural production, as Remco mentioned earlier in the day. I want to talk about our role in cultural production, especially specifically as it pertains to digital culture and making. And one thing that I want to talk about is this idea of safe spaces. And so this might be a term some of you have heard before, and this might be a new term for some of you. Basically, when you're working within a community, some communities have what are called safe space policies, and that's a shared set of values and guidelines for that community to agree upon. And of course, when you have a community of smart adults, as I think most of you, or if not all of you are, I should hope so. I think so. I'm getting good vibes. It's why would you expect someone to do something wrong? Why would you expect someone to come to your work or your community and do something hurtful? That's because I think most people don't. Most people don't do bad things on purpose. I genuinely believe that. However, if you don't mutually agree in your space what types of behaviors are agreeable or not okay, when something that's not so great happens, when something that makes someone feel uncomfortable or bad happens, that places the burden of responsibility onto the person who's been hurt. And if you want to cultivate a diverse space, which is, I would argue, an innovative space, you need to make that space as welcoming as possible for folks from different backgrounds and cultural experiences. So I mentioned, diverse space is an innovative space. Why do I think that? And that's because the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein spoke a lot about how language frames organized thought. And so I think that's pretty true, and I think language frames our relationship to disciplines. So, for an example, we know what a horse is and we know what a rhinoceros is, and subsequently, because we have these two bodies of knowledge about what these two individual things are, we can imagine what a unicorn will be. And so subsequently, I believe if we want innovation in our fields, whether it's innovation for a product or social innovation or technological innovation, we need to combine fields and we need to combine experiences. And when we draw experience from only a specific group of folks, I think we're really eliminating a lot of potential. So that's me on diversity and safe spaces. Oh yeah, this is a great project. This is Aidan Robinson, and he created this hand in collaboration with an artist named Kobe Unger. And actually, this is really relevant to the next question in the prompt, which is what kinds of errors and opportunities arise when these two worlds meet, the digital and the physical. So one of these opportunities is collaboration. So this is not an example of Project Enable, but what Project Enable is, it's a really, really cool group that designs and 3D prints prosthetic hands for kids who don't have them. 3D printing and prosthetics is actually one of the most exciting parts of 3D printing for me, because there's a lot of those Yoda heads out there in the world, but if you give a kid a hand, that's arguably pretty good. And so something that's also really cool about 3D printing prosthetics is that kids grow all the time. Traditional prosthetics are extremely expensive. If you heat up the material on these prosthetics, you can kind of grow the prosthetic along with the kid for a little while, which is, I think, really, really exciting. And subsequently, it also means collaboration. So, Instructables, which is a how-to website, is part of Autodesk. And so if you look at Instructables, there are how-to instructions for doing all kinds of projects, including this arm for Aiden. And he requested a Lego attachment, so that's what you're seeing there. There's also one for playing the violin and the Nintendo Wii. So you also, we see folks who are struggling with technical problems, and you have people from all over the world contributing feedback and helping each other, which I think is just super, 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 super cool. And so the last two questions in the prompt, this is Banaz Farahi. I think Banaz's work is really, really, really gorgeous, but this is part of why I get really concerned about form and experience. Because this is a beautiful, beautiful object, but I have anxieties about it. And this is John Edmark, also really, really exciting project. Okay, so the last two questions are about aesthetics. So what kinds of errors and opportunities arise when, is a new aesthetic always bound up in formal exploration of algorithms, or is there something else that can happen? And is it important for there to be a new aesthetic, or is it inevitable? So I want to talk about a concept from a scholar named Ian Bogost, and I know a lot of Ian's work from games, and he comes up with this in one of his texts. He talks about this idea of rhetoric, and he defines rhetoric as persuasive expression. And so he explains that different media have different rhetorics. So certain types of media are better at emphasizing particular types of information, and other media are less effective at communicating that types of information. So he gives the example of games, and he says that games are especially productive for communicating what he calls procedural rhetoric, which is the language of systems. So if you think about it, if you've ever played a game, winning a game means understanding and mastering and working within a system. If you take, for example, film or television, prioritizes the visual. Marshall McLuhan talked about that a lot in terms of his hot and cold media discussion. If you look at the JFK-Nixon debate on TV, what kind of made or broke the discussion was Nixon's flop sweat. So a question that I'm really curious about when it comes to this conversation about digital and physical and rhetoric, I want to know, what is the rhetoric of digital fabrication? What types of information, what types of ideas is digital fabrication really, really good at communicating? And what are some of its weaknesses? What gets lost when we think about digital fabrication? So in that note, I'd like to open it up to Greg, who can open up to discussion.
I can reopen. You circled around everything we're going to do. And I think a good place to start, because I'm going to strain a bit here to find a bit of a thread between the two presentations. I mean, there were several, but one that jumped out to me. James, you talked a lot about, like, you have an anxiety about architects just kind of thinking they can replace those individuals in the orange jackets and kind of make the trades go away, or have maybe a diminished role in the creation process. And you thought about safe space and diversity and inclusion. I mean, once upon a time, if you were learning a craft, whatever it was, metalsmith or painting, you'd apprentice and you'd go learn the master's ways and, put in many years and then make as they make, and you'd maybe be in a guild. There's been a few conversations today about, if you're say like learning software art in art school or something like that, you'll be like on GitHub and looking at tutorials and sharing mock-ups and stuff like that, and it's a completely open type practice. So what type of kind of optimism do you guys have about kind of knowledge sharing outside of disciplinary silos specifically? Because you talked about the people in the orange jackets and the architects, but they're still different camps. Is there opportunities for them to kind of merge in some sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I think that there are. Well, I mean, number one, I think the number one thing, one of the terms that we prefer to use at Sims is, rather than just talking about digital fabrication, is the notion of what was on the slide, digitally assisted fabrication, and that it's not just about just the machine, but it's about how this machine can work in existing contexts or existing schools of thought or in different trades. So for the stonemasons, I do think I'm not suggesting that it's not going to, there is the potential for radical change to happen within stonemason or stone cutting industries. There is already kind of a before the stone arrives on site, there's this this huge industrial process that it happens beforehand, before it gets to the guy, and then he kind of does his hand thing on site. But I do think it is going to change. For instance, the notion of what a stonemason is, in the same way that it's changed the way people do welding and all kinds of other things. And so, yeah, I think that using collaborative tools, I think BIM is a big one that we also are doing a lot of research in. But having a platform that multiple people can communicate in, and not just entirely digitally. And I think that's one of the important things is with the Masons as well. They're so kind of digitally illiterate that it's important that we're able to go from kind of the analog world to the digital world, and that as architects you can be working digitally and you can be working with someone that is not necessarily so digitally literate, but the kind of tools and technologies can allow you guys to still communicate by digitizing and outputting and having kind of a back and forth. So.
Yeah, and right off the bat, there are two types of optimism that I could identify when it comes to this type of knowledge sharing, and one is rapid prototyping. I think that there's some really exciting work being done in that regard that I think can be very helpful to some folks. So I earlier in the week I spoke about this naloxone delivery device, and I believe that's naloxone. It's a medication that can be delivered to bring people back from heroin or opiate overdoses. And traditionally, the mechanism for delivering, if you've seen Pulp Fiction, yeah, they stab her with that syringe. That's kind of similar to what that is. But also in real life, for a very long time, and probably in some places now, there are like caps you need to take off and like nibs you need to like open and close. And so if you're in a high stress moment and needing to deliver this life-saving medication, there's like 9 separate parts of this device to fit together. And so this design consultancy Frog put together this really, really beautiful, simple, easy to use delivery tool for this drug, and it's got a cap and you pop it right off and you just shoot it up your nose. Which I think is the result of many, many types of, and it's 3D printed, I should mention that. So it's 3D printed, and that's how they were able to prototype the design. They spent a lot of time watching medical professionals in hospitals, and that observation helped them make a better thing. And another thing that I'm really optimistic about is that digital fabrication means that we can more easily share particular types of experiences and bodies of knowledge in specific ways. So I'm thinking specifically about an artist named Morrishin Aliari. You may be familiar with her work. What she does is she created her own 3D models through lots of research and communicating with folks all over the world of sculptures that were destroyed by ISIS. And so not only is she kind of recreating these objects that otherwise would have been gone forever, but there's a drive containing the models within the sculptures as well. So she's kind of sharing this information, but simultaneously the aesthetic qualities of the object the new object are so different from the original destroyed object. There's also simultaneously like a real feeling of loss that she's articulating in a very, very real and meaningful way.
I mean, that's a really great project. I mean, one thing that came to mind, I was researching like the Luddites, in advance of my technological anxiety talk. And I saw a funny line on Wikipedia, maybe written by Hack, Wikipedia editor, talking about how they weren't anti-technology per se, but just labor strategists, which maybe is a little bit of an embellishment on their position. But I was wondering, like, when you're engaging with stonemasons, like you talked about at some point in the process, they talked about, we can't work with this, we can work with this. Like, did you find them resistant to change or flexible, or? Because I mean, earlier I was asking about like mercantile and guilds and kind of established ways of working, and like what are the kind of frictions you come up against when you're dealing with a kind of solidified profession when you're bringing them new workflows?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think again, I think it's important that the digital bump into reality, because as is the case in many situations, there's technical solutions are often easy to find. But then when you're actually working with people, the solutions are not necessarily so easy. So yes, we did get a lot of resistance at the beginning. But that being said, as with any group, the Masons are not a homogenous group. So we kind of assumed they all were kind of in the same camp. But over time, and part of it was building trust. So proving maybe I'll kind of back up a little bit. We did those kind of 3D prints and some CNC stuff to kind of present to them. Again, they'd never seen anything like that. And so they basically said, very interesting, but we're not that interested. That being said, there was two kind of specific Masons who have a very kind of specific position on technology, and not just technology in stone cutting, but in heritage stone cutting. But then we learned that there was other Masons who we kind of all grouped them together, when in reality they all have different positions, who were more open. There's a difference, again, the Dominion sculptor that we worked with, he considers himself a sculptor. The Masons consider themselves stone carvers. So he was much more open, and I think that's the tradition of sculpture, where there's a sculptor's workshop and where there's multiple apprentices, and he might do some maquettes and then have somebody else do it and have somebody else cast it, but he's ultimately responsible. So he's much more receptive. That being said, after we did the OWL project, then some of the Masons came back to us. And since that time, we've done now a few different projects, and there's other projects that are coming in the future. So I think part of it was about building trust. There's some of the Masons that will never convince that this is appropriate, and others who just say that if this is, they see it as a valuable tool, and it could be useful to them, and that they'll make use of it. I mean, there's all kinds of, we could talk about through the lens of art, through the lens of this or that, but there's also health and safety concerns. They have to wear respirators. Silica, sandstone, silicosis is kind of like asbestosis. It gets lodged in their lungs, and there's all kinds of things that you could debate about whether this technology is appropriate or not. But I think the main thing that we're trying to get at is that you can use this technology and not diminish skills. Sometimes those skills are going to change, no doubt it's going to change, but that you can in fact use it, and it's not just about crushing the stonemasons.
It's never just about pushing a green button.
Yes, exactly.
Make project go now. And of course you didn't necessarily, like Autodesk, which I know we're beyond, and maybe I won't ask another question about it. It's kind of a nexus of various industrial stakeholders and traditions. How did you find activating that technology for essentially an engineering company through art? Like what kind of challenges did you encounter there?
Yeah, I think that the service that and the benefit that Pier 9 provides is of great importance when it comes to the field of digital fabrication, including art made with technology. Because if you look at traditional arts institutions, especially in the US, that support isn't really there in the same kinds of ways. Autodesk provides stipends, training, all kinds of stuff. So there were some moments in which I was really pleased by how ready they were as a brand to just be like, okay, like now we're going to have an art exhibition, and now we're going to do public installations, and now we're going to have calls for proposals. And that was great, because especially having worked in traditional arts institutions for a really long time, I'm used to having like really tiny budgets and having to go through a lot of bureaucracy. Conversely, there were some moments at Autodesk in which I felt like not everyone necessarily understood the intentions behind my projects, because I was there because I came from a different background than everyone else. And so one of the projects that I was really excited to support was something called the Experimental Research Lab, which came directly from mine and Mortian Aliari's concern about the dominance of form over context or discussion or criticality in certain digital fabrication spaces. And what that was is an interdisciplinary research group that we supported that did really, really, really excellent work, both fabricating objects and producing traditional research surrounding software companies in the Bay Area and their interconnected histories with the military-industrial complex. And that was really, really exciting. But, as I told Greg the other day, there were often many moments in which my colleagues would come up to me like, why are they here? Why are they in this building? And I feel like we should ask them. You should. So it's really, really easy to talk the talk about collaboration in your spaces, but it's something different to make it happen. And I think that it takes some doing. It takes some conversations. It takes some work. It takes some beer sometimes, or pachacuchas, or group sailing outings. But it's not just so like a switch for a lot of people. So part of doing the work, part of doing this innovation is not only that, like perfecting the technical skill, but also refining the relationships between the different experts you have working in your space.
I like that bit about not necessarily just the beer, but the convergence of disciplines. I always find whenever you're at kind of a multidisciplinary event, the beginning of it, everybody is speaking their language, and then by the end, you kind of have like a common tongue. So that interests me a lot, this idea of bringing people together. This is a tough question, and I don't know how to ask it, and I don't know if either of you can answer it. But looking at some of the earlier projects that were discussed, I think it was Joanna that showed that cellular autonoma 3D printed shoe, and like the easiest example I could think of, like digital vernacular aesthetics, would be like, I don't know how many of you are familiar with data moshing, which is like kind of like a video technique using the codecs that are in YouTube, and essentially video artists were like fooling around with this about 10 years ago. And like essentially if you run it too low on video and then the scene changes, you get kind of this gobbledygook that spreads into the next scene. It's a very pixelated digital native kind of aesthetic, and it was kind of the purview of software artists for a bit, and then like Kanye West released a video in 2009 or 11, Welcome to Heartbreak, using it. And that's an example of like a digital-born artifact that has aesthetic qualities, and you wouldn't come to that through oil paint or stonework or insert medium here. So in digital fabrication, maybe you speaking to work you've seen or know of, and you kind of thinking in the architectural space and trying to reconcile that workflow with built form and the people in the orange jackets. What are kind of like, what is to what degree can we kind of see, or do we want to see like the grain of the digital in things that are fabricated either through 3D printing or mass customization? And again, that's a tough question. So this might even be the moment we like include the audience. We'll see.
I mean, I think that I'm most interested in, I don't want to rip off Johan, your idea of intention, but actually, who's someone help me out here, the Australian architect that works on Sagrada Familia?
Gaudi.
Mark Burry in digital or in scripting cultures. He kind of takes a position against just the kind of generative architecture where you're using algorithms to kind of just generate form, but that behind your scripts there should be some kind of intentionality. So he's using algorithms and parametric software to rebuild, or not rebuild, but to continue to build the Sagrada Familia. So I would say that I kind of share that kind of idea, that I'm not so interested in the kind of generative architecture where people are running algorithms and, oh, look at that looks cool. I think that it's more, I'm more interested in kind of intention and harnessing digital tools to do something that, not that there can't be some kind of exploration and mix-ups and sloppiness along the way, but that nonetheless, you start with an intention and work with that.
Just to drill into like one specific example, like, so I was reading James's paper on the stonework restoration type stuff, and there's one kind of moment when you're kind of identifying a mesh artifact because you've done a scan, and then you've got the relief, and then you essentially like clean it up, and then, you know, the clay is applied. But that, I guess I'm asking about like, at what moments does that mesh artifact become a feature rather than a bug? And
I don't have an answer, like I can't say, oh, this is when or this isn't, but in this process, it's something that kind of, it was obliterated by the handwork, right? Like, so the sculptor removed basically all the digital trace. We've had internal discussions at Sims about, so for instance, also when we were doing the original CNC of the existing condition, so this was out of foam, it took so long to cut it on the CNC, like literally days, that the CNC lost steps. So basically, it didn't know where the tool was. It thought the tool was in one place, just slightly. So the difference between a roughing pass and then the finishing pass, it was leaving these kinds of strange lines. And we had this discussion like, well, this is part of the process. And wouldn't it be interesting that there's this building built, the owl was actually early 1900s. So wouldn't it be interesting that when it gets replaced, that there is these kind of digital traces in there? In that particular instance, it didn't actually manifest itself. But I think that these things, I'm not going to say good, bad, whatever, but I think that they should be kind of analyzed further, I guess, yeah.
Yeah. There are a couple material qualities that I've observed, or sensory qualities at least, that I've observed that are kind of consistent artifacts within certain modes of digital fabrication. One is styration, right? Depending on the type of 3D printing or additive manufacturing process you're using, you might be likely to see kind of layers emerge. Also, similarly, just this kind of act of or the idea of slices, of thinking of a 3D object as like just a stack of slices of things on top of each other. Also, burn marks, right? If you've taken something off the laser cutter and you've got the heat up too high, you'll tend to see that kind of crispy edge. Also, this idea of particular smells, like a resin smell or a laser cutter smell, and also dust, like MDF dust or dust from any dust collection system. And, you know, it's very easy for me to equate a lot of these artifacts in some ways with failure, right? So, like, there is a certain aesthetic of failed 3D prints, which I've seen a lot of, which can be kind of cool, but also very expensive and in some ways, like, extremely tragic, because, especially if you're using something like ABS, there's a significant ecological impact, but also a lot of these printers use proprietary resin that's just extremely costly and not recyclable. So that's the aesthetic of the failed print is something I think about a lot too. And as well as, this is almost is like a badge of pride, but like the gash in the material's bad. Like, one of my favorite artists that I used to work with at Autodesk, we had a big DMS mill. And like one time, I guess he just goofed up his tool path or something, and instead of like moving the head into his material, he just like gouged it right into the bed. And everyone in the workshop was like, "Yeah, you should autograph that. You should sign that." He was so worried that he would get in trouble, but everyone just gave him high fives. And I guess in certain spaces, we really reward this idea of pushing things to their edge, trying our best and being as experimental as possible. Although I do find this is exclusively limited to formal experimentation and not necessarily social experimentation in spaces. But some risks are easier to take in certain circumstances.
So can I just follow up on one? Because also there's this. Just this idea of skill and the tools kind of leaving their mark. But I also find it interesting working on the Parliament buildings that we have this idea that everybody in the past, all these stonemasons, were these highly skilled craftsmen. And in reality, in Ottawa, in the time that these were built, there was not a strong stone carving tradition. And there was actually tons of horrible work on the Parliament buildings. Now, there are beautiful buildings, and there is a lot of great work, but just the way the construction of some of the like how the stone is actually put together in the wall, that the stone should actually be like say a foot deep, and then they remove the stone, and the stone is a foot deep on one end, but it actually tapers to like an inch or so on the other end, and this is just a big cavity that water is getting into, and what was the other? So there was another example I was going to think of, but yeah, I just also think that in this idea of arts and crafts and skill, that to always kind of say that, you know, the handcraft was always better and that the digital is different. And again, I don't think it's either or. I think they both exist together. So. Then.
I mean, I've got some more questions, but maybe we'll see if anybody in the audience has
Sure,
any.
I'm going to jump in because I get to grab
Ryan
the
time.
microphone. And I had two things just before we open it up to the question. One being, I'd like to propose a show that's like when algorithms go bad, but it would be sort of architecture and art. I think there would be a really exciting, terrifying kind of...
Predictive policing is an artifact of that.
The other was just to Sarah, in terms of what you were going through the sort of provocation for the panel and the text, and I thought it's really great to pick up on the idea. I think the way it's written, it kind of sounded as if it was really about just formalism in some ways. It was about a sort of formal idea of what happens to materials and projects and objects as you move them back and forth in space. But I think picking up on the idea that in that is this sort of social, political, economic context of what it means, so that there's, you know, I wouldn't assert anything quite so simple as there's two cultures between an analog and digital, but those are considerations: the culture of the workshop, the culture of the environment that it's made in, but also the sort of those biases built into the technology itself, and we think of it, well, everything is this collection of technologies that you're always working with, these layers and layers, that some of those things are invisible, and what can make them visible is actually this process of moving things between the physical and the digital. So that was just a comment. I thought I was fair because you were picking apart what I said. So, do we have any questions from the floor? Or questions you want to articulate? No?
I've got another one. I mean, and this is something that was kind of touched on earlier. Tom, when you're talking about setting up your lab and that student that helped, essentially this idea that, oh, well, maybe it should be a little more open and people not quite can see under the hood of the machines, but see how we use them. Just thinking like at Ars Electronica this year, there's a piece a little problematic by this artist Quayle, using, I mean, there's lots we could talk about that, but specifically using robot arms to mill like Michelangelo's statues out of foam. And it was performative, you know what I mean? It's not like the statues were displayed, but the fabrication of them was displayed, and maybe that was gimmicky or maybe that was savvy, I'm not sure. But what opportunities are there to kind of foreground this process? I mean, in architecture, I guess, in a lot of design, it might be just something that happens in a shop or happens on site and then is never seen again. But in curating, like I know you can use them in a performative sense. What are the opportunities there? Do you guys have any thoughts?
Yeah, that was actually one of the best things about working at Pier 9. I had worked in traditional arts institutions for a while before heading over there. And, especially when I was in grad school and curating school, there was a lot of talk about, what does it mean to remove the object from the context in which it was produced, this idea of the artist studio and the site specificity. So really like what the way an artwork looks and fits within context within an artist studio is really, really different than putting it in a white cube, right? Or alongside artworks made by other folks. So context is something that I think about a lot, and I think about, okay, well, what can we communicate to the public, to the viewers about, where stuff comes from? And so that was something really cool. But what we did in Autodesk is that at the end of each artist in residence cohort, there's an exhibition. And so what we did is we didn't rent out a gallery. We installed all the artwork that was produced on or in or near the machines that produce the work. So the 3D printed objects were on or inside the 3D printers. We put boards on top of our water jet and put something, industrial cut felt sculpture that had been made on that machine on there. And it was really cool and really successful because folks, instead of just being like, oh, here's like a shiny plastic thing, you could see like, oh, this is a thing that made it, and this is like the gestures it had to do in order to like apply the material to the object. And especially as a curator, you get to have more conversations about those things as well. And that was super meaningful. Of course, it was extremely laborious. I worked with a team of over 20 people to baby-proof our workshop, which meant deblading every single machine and de-energizing most of the workshop and putting plexi over like lots of our drawers with sharp things in them. But it was totally worth it because I think that people walked in without understandings of how things got made and left with a little bit more. And I think that was our objective.
I get maybe I'll my elitist architecture background will show through, but I guess I'm not that interested. I'm mostly interested in working with highly skilled people and making really interesting things. That being said, no, I don't think that I want to be secretive, but I just am more interested in collaborating with highly talented people, and whether other people are interested or not, I can make myself available at events like this and talk about it. So.
There we go. Do we have any questions from the audience?
So, yeah.
Oh, there we go. We got a hand.
You made a comment when you were showing us a slide of a wearable artwork that we also saw this morning, where I believe it reacted to people looking. And so you talked about being a beautiful piece, but then in the same sentence, we're talking about your anxiety about it.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you, because I think I've read about that piece earlier, and I had some thoughts, but I'd like, if you could you expand a little bit about your complex reaction to it?
Most definitely. Well, it's called caress of the gaze, and I think from a theoretical perspective in critical theory, the gaze is kind of a loaded term, and so it was interesting for me for a piece to kind of like own that usage of the word gaze and have it be a very deliberately sexualized piece. Just like there's lots of exposed skin. It's about eye tracking, right? So you have in the image or in the promotional video, there's a video of a figure just like staring at this woman and the garment response. So it's hard for me to get amped about staring at women's chests, although I completely understand and I have observed the immense technical skill involved in the production of that object. It is of some critical weight to me to note that piece was made on the object printer. That object, that resin is proprietary resin. It is not recyclable. It is extremely expensive. Like so many artworks, it had to be prototyped multiple times. So as someone coming from my particular set of biases, like I have immense respect for it as an object, as a design object, but as a scholar and a critic, I have criticism. So yeah.
And the intention of the artist was, in your opinion, was it to highlight the issue of the gaze, or was it playing into that?
So something really interesting about the Artist in Residence program at Autodesk is that it welcomes folks who don't necessarily identify as capital A artists. So there are designers, architects, folks working with food. And so Banaz, I believe, comes from partially an architecture background. So I would let her, it's really a shame that she's not here to dialogue with me. But one thing that I will say is that in commercial spaces, there's not a lot of room for critical dialogue. And that's part of why we started that experimental research lab program.
So perhaps I'll give my 2 cents worth. So I know Banaz and Anouk. I've visited the space. It's amazing. One thing I can say about wearables, if we are to talk about culture, is that it's like the one technological space where basically women kick ass, So when you are at a meeting with fashion tech, it's like there'll be one guy to 12 women. Now, I think there's a number of, we could pull that apart in terms of why that is. Is it because other spaces are less accommodating? Is it because there's a kind of more intuitive interest in the body? I don't know. I don't have that answer. I think that's a whole book. But I do know Banaz. She's doing a PhD. She's from media arts. She's really smart. And actually, she's sort of building on a piece that Ying Gao had done, which also was using tracking the gaze and kinetic movements. I can't speak for her, but I know that she's certainly doing it in a very aware, she's American, Iranian, feminist, hardcore. And so she's certainly not doing this naively, and she's probably questioning, but again, I can't speak for her.
And it makes me deeply yearn for more formalized spaces to have these types of discussion, because I'd like, the way the internet works, it's so easy to just be like, here's this cool video and here's this article, and we're going to talk about like the things that are immediately apparent about the object, and not necessarily like make space for the artist to talk about these were my intentions, as opposed to this is what the thing does, which is tragic, frankly.
I mean, anybody in the room have a beer with me later, and I'll talk about that at length. That's a tragedy, that like blogification of design praxis into like PR reproduction, essentially press release republication with the photos of a project, and that's what gets circulated in most of a design press, with some exceptions. It's really unfortunate. I got a good thread to follow up on from earlier for each of our panelists' pet peeves in and around fabrication.
So we'll wrap up with the pet peeves, and then we'll take a small break.
And on a sour note, other than performing systems.
Yeah, no. Well, I think it's actually not unlike your last comment, but well, number one is trying to put my thoughts together here, but I mean, again, it comes back to part of this is my PhD, right? So I'm so into my PhD that that's all I can see. But that this idea of translation in architecture, I hate when the kind of artifacts of design, so whether it's sketches or whatever, or now with the 3D prints, is when architects kind of holding up those things as art, and this notion of architects holding exhibits on these artifacts. When I guess I have the position that these artifacts are something that I don't think they're art in and of themselves, but I think they're part of a process that leads to a building, and so it's the building that should be the focus. And so, yeah, so I think that holding up kind of, especially with the digital fabrication, holding up these kind of small pieces as art, as opposed to things that are process work that lead to a building, I think that's kind of the kind of artifying of architectural making, I guess.
But I mean, lots of studios incubate in kind of that space for 15 or 20 years of just making those artifacts, and it's about meditating on the process, and then eventually, they're suddenly dealing with a lot of commissions, so it's different speeds of practice almost. But I get your point, and I think there can definitely be a really awkward place in between art and architecture. Sometimes it's just pick a side, please. Anyways.
Yeah, I touched on this earlier, but one of my personal pet peeves, which is certainly not like. Pet peeves are not facts. They are not like universal truths. This comes from my own personal bias and subjectivity, which let's all remember, every institution is imbued with subjectivity, regardless of it is forthcoming about that or not. And that is an emphasis on form exclusively and separating form from context and personal experience. There's a phenomenon I see a lot in art made with technology that I sometimes refer to as the mechanism or the apparatus dwarfing content, and it's kind of like the science museum effect where you press a button and a volcano explodes, and it's just like, yes, that's awesome, that's so cool, but then you don't necessarily stick around to have the conversation about why did the volcano explode, what just happened here, as I was talking with someone about this earlier, it's totally cool and important to have those moments of just inspiration and excitement and enthusiasm. I love James Turrell's work, and if I'm in one of his installations, I'm not like, what is this about? But instead I can allow myself to have an experience. However, especially considering the fact that I am very close to artwork made with technology, and I'm very invested in furthering and developing the art historical critical discourse surrounding art made with technology, I'm really invested in having those conversations about where do the materials come from? Who is this person? Why are they making this object? How is it received critically or by members of just the general public? Because if we don't have these conversations, who knows what the archive's going to look like? Who knows what the future of art history is going to be like? Who knows what the future of value of these works is going to be like? How are these people going to get paid? Will their work accrue value over time? gosh, I don't know. But I'm really invested in creating frameworks for talking about these things, and I don't think they are to be taken lightly. Another thing that I have a kind of a pet peeve about is this idea of being very particular about divisions of field. And I think it's really easy to be like, no, I'm not an artist. I'm sorry. I think people should be able to identify as whatever they want, but people be like, oh no, that's not art, that's design. Or like, and I see that happen all the time, and I think it's when we make divisions between high culture or low culture, or everyday objects or specific objects, those are political decisions. And I think that sometimes we feel the need to make these distinctions when it's not completely necessary to. But that's just my Boysian, Klaus Oldenburgian, hippy-dippy, lefty Californian perspective.
And there we go. Well, any of these conversations can be picked up later. So thanks to our panelists. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.